Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you to PMP Live. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. At any time during the next hour, at any point, you can click on the link that I will be putting in the chat to purchase Black Smoke African Americans in the United States of Barbecue on the Politics and Prose website. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. We are delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, click on the live transcript option. Just look for the CC at the bottom of your screen. Finally, thank you again for being here with us today. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Adrian Miller is a certified Kansas City Barbecue Society judge and a recipient of a James Beard Foundation Book Award for Soul Food, the surprising story of an American cuisine, one plate at a time. A consultant on Netflix Chef's Table Barbecue, Miller's most recent book is The President's Kitchen Cabinet, the story of the African Americans who have fed our first families from the Washingtons to the Obamas. Miller will be in conversation with Tim Carman, who is a food reporter at the Washington Post. Before joining the Post, he served for 5 years as food editor and columnist at Washington City Paper. Carman's previous jobs included managing editor at the Houston Press and entertainment reporter and critic at the Houston Post. Please join me in welcoming them both to PMP Live. Gentlemen.
Thank you. Well, this is a great honor to talk with Adrian. I've had the pleasure of talking with Adrian many times over the years, and I've been anxiously awaiting this book. I think since the first time you told me about it, pre-pandemic, and here it is. So congratulations, Adrian. I'm sure you're probably the happiest to see it out there.
I see no lies in what you just said.
So let's get right into it. There's a lot to discuss here. And, let's talk first about, I guess, the basic genesis of barbecue. It's a very controversial and a subject, and I think one that people have tried to dissect, but I think you have probably done the most diligent job that I have read. And if you could just talk a little bit about your your research into the Native American influence in barbecue.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So, one thing that just never quite gelled for me was the whole Caribbean origin of barbecue in what was the American South. And the reason why is we know that Europeans show up in the Caribbean around in the late 1400s. They see indigenous people cooking in a way that they weren't familiar with it. And then the idea was that then the Europeans brought this and their animals to the American South, and then that started barbecue. But that just completely ignores what indigenous people were doing in North America. And so I really wanted to delve into that. And the other big thing is that the way that Southern barbecue emerges, this trench filled with hardwood burning coals, with whole animals butterflied and flipped over, that was different than the cooking that was described in the Caribbean. And so I want to share my screen real quick and just show some of the illustrations in my book. So hold on just a second here. All right, that's me loving some barbecue. Okay, so what I did is I looked at what Europeans wrote about when they were first traveling through the American South and what they saw from indigenous people. And so that's not right. There we go. So we've got piercing sticks. So the idea was that sticks were planted in the ground, and then meat was either put on the, morsels of meat were either put on the very tip or kind of butterflied or flayed out in a way. And then the stick was angled towards the fire. And that was the cooking. Then you also had spit cooking. And now rotating spit was something that Europeans would have been used to because it was very familiar with how they cooked. Another method was the raised platform. So that's what we see described in the Caribbean. And we now know that at least around the time of European contact, Native Americans were doing something similar in the American South. Another technique is the earth oven, the idea that you dig a vertical hole, you put your fuel source at the bottom. Usually rocks were mixed in with the wood in order to retain heat. And then you layer with pieces of meat and vegetation. You bury it or seal it somehow. And then after a period of time, usually overnight, you come by and you dig up that, and then you eat some really tasty food. Usually not smoky because it was protected by vegetation. So the smoke flavor was light. And then you had the shallow pit. Now this is I'm skipping ahead a little bit with this illustration because this is what Southern barbecue looks like. But the shallow pit was usually, coals, the meat was laid on top probably. And so what we find is that later on, Europeans look at what Native Americans were doing. They bring their cooking techniques and meld it. And then later enslaved Africans and enslaved African Americans get into the mix. And that eventually becomes what we call Southern barbecue. So I just wanted people to see those different cooking techniques.
And I think you bring this out in your book, but you talk about the different Indian tribes that use these different techniques. And they were, in different parts of the country where they could be an influence on those, I get, well, why don't you explain a little bit more just about how, different techniques used by different tribes and how that eventually made its way into what was once, known as Virginia barbecue, where there was a large, predominant, most of the African slaves were found in Virginia back at a certain period. And there is the theory that you propose is that that knowledge was likely transferred from native indigenous populations to enslaved people from Africa.
Yeah, so I'm relying a lot on the work of Joe Haynes and Andrew Worms, who kind of looked at the early history of barbecue. And although multiple techniques existed in Virginia, the shallow pit seemed to be something that was around, used by those tribes. And so I think Europeans saw the shallow kind of pit method and then said, okay, we're going to bring some of our quick grilling techniques and merge it with that and create this trench method, which is something different and similar to the clam bake that exists in the North. And then that digging a trench and filling it with wood that's burned down and then cooking the animals over that's eventually what's called Southern barbecue. But it starts out being called Virginia barbecue, as you note. And it's really Virginians who take this cooking style around the South that eventually we get to Southern barbecue. So I think it really was them looking at what indigenous people were doing and then kind of mixing in their own kind of culinary heritage. And, that's the nature of cooking, right? When you come into contact with other people, you look at what they're doing, you experiment, and then sometimes it leads to something new.
Well, it's interesting. In your book, you used a term I'd never heard before, and I'll probably butcher the pronunciation, but carbonatoing.
Yes.
And this goes back to 15th century Italy. This idea that this is a charcoal cooking method Europeans used and perhaps melded into the Native American tradition.
Right, because when you think about what Native Americans were doing, of course, they were sometimes cooking meat for immediate consumption, right? But a lot of times they were doing it for preservation. So the way that they were preparing meat was, sometimes there were Europeans that wrote that, hey, sometimes this stuff would cook for days with a very slow fire, right? Low heat, low smoke, and that's how it was prepared. And so carbonating was just a faster grilling technique by Europeans done on something called a gridiron. So imagine a square, you've seen a football field, right? The lines that go across the field. Well, the old nickname for that is the gridiron. And this is really just reminiscent of this this cooking utensil that was essentially an iron thing that sat on the floor of the fireplace. You would put coals or wood underneath it, and you would put the meat on top of that, and you could get the grill marks and everything. But it was a way to cook parts of meat very quickly. And so that, I think, leads to going from the shallow pit method to where we have eventually, first of all, it was just really sticks laid across, but then it gets to, metal and other things much later. But I think that really starts to come together in the South and create what we call barbecue.
Well, and, I know you also investigate, Adrian, the idea that, West African West Africa could have some influence on this. And you go into it, but you're sort of hampered by the oral tradition and the lack of documentation. And I don't know if you could give us a sense of what you thought and discovered about West African influence on barbecue.
Yeah, because look, seriously, I wanted to find a definitive West African origin. I wanted to cross my arms across my chest and say Wakanda forever. But, it's just tricky because the way that West Africans cook meat, and it depends on where you are, really it doesn't really look like barbecue as Southern barbecue developed. And there were certainly meat cooking and smoking traditions in West Africa, but, not what we see as Southern barbecue. To the extent that there was pit cooking happening in Africa, it was usually in Northern Africa. There's a whole kind of Arab cooking tradition that's kind of like pit cooking that existed there. But in terms of the Igbo people, who were the ones who heavily populated Virginia, just from what we know of how they cooked at that time, it really wasn't barbecue. So what I think happened is African techniques with seasoning and then adeptness with cooking gets fused in with culinary practices for barbecue. So it's really the honed experience of African Americans who become barbecue's principal cooks that, affects barbecue's development. But I really think the pivotal moments are Europeans melding their carbonadoing technique with Native American smoking techniques to create this kind of intermediate type of cooking.
Well, we were talking yesterday, and you had expressed this notion that enslaved people brought over from West Africa and barbecue are sort of impossibly intertwined. And there is a history there that you are trying to lay out and show why the black or the descendants of West African slaves became so tied to barbecue. And I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen again and go back to this earlier picture, because this is really the quintessential look at barbecue by the time we get to the mid 1800s. And so, come on, whoops. Sorry about that. And of course, this is not playing. So anyway, earlier, let me see if I can do it this way. So here we have a picture from basically Harper's Weekly. And in the middle, you see this trench, you see African Americans cooking, and you see how it's an experience that's viewed by others. And so that was quintessentially what barbecue was in the 1800s and well into the 1900s, actually, until the early decades of the 1900s. And so what was curious to me is that as I was looking through sources like newspapers and stuff, there would be newspaper articles that would say, okay, if you're going to have Southern barbecue or Virginia barbecue, you must have a Negro man do X, Y, and Z. So essentially, African Americans become part of the recipe, really, for legit barbecue. And so barbecue is tied with slavery because barbecue is so labor intensive. Because, you have to clear a brush, you have to dig that trench, you have to chop that wood, you have to kill those animals, somebody's got to cook it. And then as barbecue emerges as a social event, it's a Black experience from start to finish, because at the beginning of the process, you've got African Americans doing the cooking. And then when the barbecue was served, usually it was African Americans doing the serving. And then after the barbecue, African Americans were the entertainment. And so there would be games, cakewalks, singing, all that kind of stuff. From start to finish, it was a Black experience. And it was really only after whites had gone through the whole experience that then African Americans got to eat barbecue. But I mean, the presentations are so numerous about African Americans being the principal barbecue cooks. And then after emancipation, African Americans are put on trains, boats, stagecoaches, all these things, and sent around the country to give other people an authentic taste of Southern barbecue.
Well, and you talk a lot about just the sheer scope of these, barbecue events, whether they were, so-called plantation barbecues or celebration barbecues. They could be thousands of people, and I think that goes to the point of that these were not backyard barbecues. These were not throw some charcoal in a chimney and throw it into your Weber. This was a really labor intensive effort. And like, give us a sense, Adrian, of how large some of these events could get.
Yeah, so by the time you get to the 1820s and 1830s, really two community leaders figured out barbecue was a great way to bring a crowd. And those were politicians and preachers. So for political rallies, a lot of politicians would have a host committee, would pay for all the food and everything. So it was a free event. Thousands of people would show up. So you've got reports of 10,000, 20,000. And evidently in Kentucky, there was a barbecue with 50,000 people in the 1830s. Now, I don't know if these numbers, these crowd estimates are accurate because they didn't have satellite technology back then that can help with the counting. But yeah, you see a lot of people showing up for these barbecues. And the same thing with preachers. They would have revivals or something called camp meetings, which were multi-day affairs. And usually there was a team of cooks that would prepare that food. And so I think barbecue was perfect for these giant public spectacles because it was scalable. I mean, as long as you had enough cooks and enough labor and enough food and enough space, you could put on a huge barbecue. And the reason why enslaved African Americans get associated with this is because the racial norms of the time, right? If you're gonna have anybody do hard work, you're gonna make enslaved African Americans do it, especially if you want them to do hard work and not compensate them. And so that's why, because of the largeness of the events, it's scalable, and the venue being in the American South, that's how African Americans get connected to this type of cooking.
And how much would you say like the saucing of West Africa played into the barbecue that became known as Southern barbecue?
I don't think it was a huge role because, except for this, the earliest barbecue sauces were essentially vinegar, which was what was being done in Europe and England in terms of their cooking. So I think the real touch here is the generous use of red pepper added to the vinegar. I think that is definitely an African touch, because we know that Africans were used to heavily spiced food, and we see the same thing show up in the Caribbean. And so I think that is really the African contribution to barbecue, in addition to the honed cooking experience.
Although,
and even in the early 1800s, you got people complaining about how spicy the sauce is.
That's funny.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned in the book, though, that's sort of a roundabout American influence in itself, because the peppers came from America, but became identified with Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean cooking.
Yeah, it's one of the staples. If you're going to look at a signature of kind of African diasporic cooking, the embracing of chilies is one part of that. And even though it's from the Americas, but previous to that, Africans were used to warming spices. So cardamom, ginger, they had their own kind of pepper. It wasn't as hot as the American chilies. And so you could see that the African palate was hardwired to accept this, these hotter chilies, and they just went nuts for them and incorporated them in their cooking. And then it comes back in very interesting ways when people come to this part of the world as enslaved people.
So I think one of the things you've touched upon is this idea that barbecue, antebellum period, is at least politically is different than post-Civil War period. And how the way it's politicized and used, first in the Reconstruction period as a way to secure votes among newly freed slaves. But then at the same time, it's like barbecue is so full of contradictions, as you write in your book. It's like it's both used as a tool to, help gather, earn votes for candidates, but it's also used as a tool to demonize a class of people. And so it becomes a very complicated cuisine to try to parse its both pros and cons. And I wonder if you could just touch on a little bit about how barbecue was used and abused in post-Civil War period.
Yeah, so it was an interesting time because after emancipation, you've got these very skilled African Americans, right, who have a very marketable skill. They emerge, and so they are often sought to do barbecues. And so, they're earning quite a bit of money. Some people are grumbling about the money that they're making. But you also start to get African Americans barbecuing on their own terms. Because pre-Civil War, I mean, there were, of course, times when African Americans were barbecuing, but emancipation barbecues and political barbecues drew a lot of attention, especially the latter, because there were a lot of whites who were uncomfortable with the new political status that African Americans had. And so you had several instances where people wanted to show up and disrupt these barbecues. And so they were often tinged with violence. And then at the same time, in addition to outright intimidation of African Americans in daily life, you also get this cultural soft power that was used against African Americans. So propaganda, and food was unfortunately was used as a tool to spread the ideas that African Americans were either inferior or childlike. They weren't worthy of all these new rights they had, and they certainly weren't worthy of having the status of being equals in our society. So in addition to the harmful stereotypes about fried chicken and watermelon and other foods, barbecue gets added to that list. And the other sad part of our history is that lynchings were rampant. Again, it was an example of violence as intimidation and other things. And so whenever a lynching involved fire, it was called a Negro barbecue. And so that becomes part of our history as well. And so at the very time that barbecue is being celebrated, it's a chance for African Americans to make money with this very marketable skill that really they had an overwhelming competitive advantage at, because in a way, because for racist reasons, people just thought, oh yeah, the best barbecue is going to come from a Black man. At that very same time, we have this undercurrent, a nefarious side of barbecue that's fomenting as well.
Well, and so, we get to the early 20th century, and there's beginning of the Great Migration, and you start to see the Southern barbecue movement go outside the South. And how does that impact the way barbecue is prepared and viewed in other parts of the country?
So barbecue for 2 centuries was pretty much the way that I showed earlier, that the trench, whole animals, African Americans cooking it. But that was really a rural phenomenon. So when barbecue shifts from a rural context to more of an urban context, that's where you start to see this emphasis on smaller cuts of meat, and you start to see a lot more variety in regional styles. So, a lot of people fight about these regional styles today and think that they are centuries old, but they're really only about 100 years old, maybe a little bit more. And so that's where we start to see ribs, pork shoulder, chicken, the sausages, brisket. That stuff really emerges at the turn of the 20th century. And so it's interesting just to see that change from whole animal cooking to kind of focusing on cuts of animal. And as a cook, it's a lot easier to cook something that's cut up rather than the whole animal, right? And so this transition to smaller cuts of meat in an urban context, creating artificial pits where you can barbecue pretty much all year round now, instead of being seasonal, leads to a flood in the market. So not only of African Americans, but you got a lot of white people that get into barbecue around that time as well. And if you go back through old newspapers, I'm sure the Washington Post would be the same. I mean, the classified ads for barbecue joints are so numerous, looking for cooks, servers, all that stuff. And then it seems like a lot of people didn't know what they were doing. So by the time you get to the mid 20s, early 1930s, you've got a lot of barbecue joints for sale and people trying to get out of that business. And so for that period where a lot of people flood into barbecue, I would say that African Americans are maybe at a disadvantage, because traditionally entrepreneurs have had a lack of access to capital and other things. They weren't able to open up a lot of brick and mortar spots. But I think things start to even out by the time you get to the 1930s.
Well, and you talk about the influx of the white barbecue restaurant, and some of the more famous people that were doing barbecue, like Walter Jetton, but I think one of the interesting aspects here is that you point out there's always a Black man usually, or a Black woman behind the scenes, and it was never really clear, like, the superintendent or superintending the barbecue versus, who was actually doing the work. And I don't know if you get a sense, I mean, if you have an opinion on this, was this yet another example of, white culture taking credit for something that wasn't exactly of their doing?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So, for the longest time, white culture gave credit to African-American cooks, but it really was around the 1890s that you started to see more white men getting into barbecue. And again, they were calling themselves barbecue kings, and it's unclear how much they knew about barbecue because evidently they were telling people what to do. But then you had most of them had a team of African-American cooks. So much so that there are people now today that just think the African-American role in barbecue was just being the helper. So there is a dynamic there. But in interview after interview, when these white men are pressed in terms of how they learn to cook or who they rely upon, sometimes begrudgingly, but a lot of times they would acknowledge the help of African Americans. And a lot of food writers prior to the 1990s gave a shout out to Black cooks for their role in barbecue. So much so that even today, a lot of people believe that Black people invented barbecue because of the strong associations with the cuisine.
Well, you raised it. So let's talk about the sort of transition from what has been considered like a classic Black barbecue to the 1990s, where there was a major shift to you've classified as like 4 different styles of white barbecue, and I wonder if you could run through that and how that changed the landscape of the discussion of barbecue.
Yeah, so before the 1990s, I mean, to do any kind of major story on barbecue in the US, to not include an African American, people would have thought you were really weird. But by the time we get to the 1990s, what changes is we got this new group of people called foodies. Now, we've always had people who were interested in food kind of as leisure and sport, but they tended to be very wealthy people. And some of the food media catered to them, like the Gourmets, the Bon Appetit magazines, had that kind of high-end coverage. But with foodies, you've got a group of middle-class people. They've got disposable income. Their palate is much more adventurous than their parents. They're willing to travel. And barbecue is getting really popular at the same time that this is happening. And so foodies are asking 2 questions. What is barbecue? And where can I get the good stuff? And so there's a commensurate rise in media to basically cater to this group of foodies. And unfortunately, the people that were deciding what stories got told in that food media were overwhelmingly white. And if they didn't value diversity or just were fundamentally uninterested in it, they would talk to other white people about who should get a spotlight, who should we pick as the expert. And so they kept tapping more and more white men. And really, there's kind of 4 white men that I say are the archetypes of kind of the white dudes who barbecue. So you've got the Bubba type, Dukes of Hazzard, Duck Dynasty. They show up on all these shows, right? And there's plenty of Black people in rural America, and they never get a show. Did you notice that? Anyway, you also got the competition guy, the barbecue competition circuit guy. You've got the hipster, the guy with the interesting facial hair, tattoos, glasses. And then you've got the fine dining chefs who are in barbecue in a way that you really never saw before. Somebody gave me the name Tokes Who Smoke. I wish I had thought about that while I was writing my book. That would have been cool to include. So those are the 4 guys that and they're usually guys who are put forth as barbecue experts. So much so that by the time you get to today's, certainly by the 2010s, and even today, although things are starting to get a little bit better, those are the ones who are the experts. And so we can have media put out the who's who in barbecue, the 15 pitmasters you have to know, and those lists can be all white. Whereas 20 years ago, that would have been crazy.
What do you think drove this sort of hipster movement in barbecue?
So to me, it was, and I'm not sure exactly why this happened, but I know it did happen. Barbecue gets redefined as a craft. So, barbecue has always had the trappings of craft, right? But people didn't think about it that way. It was just kind of working class food. People knew that there were cooks who did it very well, but they were never described as craftspeople. It was more like the folk art approach. And I think the difference is with folk art, you appreciate it, but it's not valued and you don't make a lot of money doing it. When something becomes craft, oh yeah, we can charge you a lot of money for that. And so once barbecue became cool, a lot of guys who would have gone into things like accounting, technology, architecture, or whatever, they're now making barbecue. And it's had ramifications because barbecue is now being redefined away from an African American aesthetic. And I'll give you a couple examples. This idea that barbecue should be unsauced. Most African Americans if I told them that, they would say, "Says who?" Because I've been to several restaurants where you get served your food and it's an ocean of sauce with little islands of smoked meat poking through. The idea that you should use high quality meat. I mean, really, should we be making brisket with Kobe beef and Wagyu? Maybe, but that's the argument that's being put out there. And most people would say, no, barbecue is about cooking the lesser cuts of meat, right? The cheap stuff. And then that the barbecue should have minimal seasoning because you want to, just salt and pepper because you want to taste the meat. That's a fine dining kind of approach to barbecue. And so, African-American barbecuers have to decide, do I want to bend to the current tastes of the mainstream or just keep doing what I do? And it has implications, right? Because if people walk into your restaurant and they're thinking barbecue is a certain way or certain thing, and that does not reflect it in what you do, if those customers turn around and leave, that's tough.
Well, and I think one of the names that gets thrown around in this modern barbecue generation is Aaron Franklin, and he's done a lot of what you specifically mentioned, like using prime beef. All of his briskets are prime. They're not the choice cuts. They're not the off bits that you would use slow and slow techniques on. And this was stuff that got a lot of media attention because of the changes or the however you want to describe what he did to this, like because of the way he treated the barbecue, it was perceived in some circles as being superior. And this has got an impact on countless other people that have been doing it for generations. And I wonder if you had a sense of like, did the black barbecue generation that came before, did they feel like they had to compete against this?
No, most definitely not. A lot of the black barbecuers, they're doing what they did before. And in some cases, they're adjusting to current tastes, but not in the sense that, this emphasis on high quality meat and just the conventional wisdom that's now emerging around barbecue. So, a lot of joints, especially old school black owned joints, they're just doing what they usually do. Because they have a very steady and devoted stream of customers who are used to having their barbecue a certain way. And they've been very good at delivering that product consistently. So, the big thing now is, probably, let me just say this. Central Texas barbecue is now the dominant barbecue style in this country. And I don't think anybody can argue against that. And I think Aaron Franklin is probably the most recognizable barbecue figure in the world. And I think it's because he was very savvy with what he was doing. He shared his techniques, capitalized on that. And I can just tell you personally, I know people in other countries that watch his video and are making the type of barbecue that he's making. So let's just talk about brisket. And when you think about Central Texas barbecue, I think people think brisket. A lot of African-American joints focused on pork and don't really have brisket on the menu. So now if you've got customers walking in the door saying, hey, where's your brisket? And you're not serving it and they leave, you might be tempted to start serving brisket. And I'm starting to see that happen in a few places, not widespread, but in a few places. And it's mixed results. Some people make it very well. There's a lot of people that aren't making good brisket. And I just have a soft spot for the places that, instead of trying to be all things to all people, focus on the things that they're really good at and keep serving that. But hey, look, I don't own a restaurant. And so I can understand the motivation to try to be all things to all people in order to survive and not close your doors.
Well, it's interesting because I think it gets to some of the heart of the politics that our country is dealing with now. Like you're talking about sort of institutions that have traditionally withheld funds for communities of color, media attention that's been mostly on white-oriented businesses. Like these things all matter in the end. It's like if you've got an Aaron Franklin barbecue, or all the Brooklyn places that popped up in the early 2000s, these are barbecue places that probably had venture capital, had bank capital, had PR people, putting them out to get media attention. These are things that become self-perpetuating, just like, generations have been. And it's like, how do you begin to compete with that without changing all the paradigms?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And fortunately, we have a few examples of people who are challenging that narrative. So I think of, two guys from the Carolinas. I think about Ed Mitchell, who is a legendary barbecuer. He's got a son who was in the kind of the private equity world who, I think 15 years ago, the son, Ryan, would have said, no way am I going to be in barbecue business with my dad. But now they're joining forces and they've got some money behind them. So COVID delayed their plans to open a restaurant last year, but they're supposed to open one up now. I mean, maybe this month or in the next couple of months. And so we'll see what happens there. And then the other guy is Rodney Scott from Hemingway, South Carolina, another guy who does whole hog barbecue. He's got money behind him as well. And he's opened up a great spot in Charleston, South Carolina. You all should definitely go. But he's got other spots in Birmingham, Alabama, and now also in Atlanta. So I could see him opening up multiple spots across the country. And you've got a whole generation of really kind of tech savvy, social media savvy barbecuers coming up too. I think of somebody like Matt Horn, who I think is just blowing it up on social media. And so I'm hopeful that we'll see more entrepreneurs really adapt to the current situation and use technology in their favor, and also attract the funds that they need to grow and succeed.
You bring up Rodney, and I think he's a fascinating person to look at, because he goes back to the traditional Southern barbecue. I mean, he's doing whole animals, and I've been to his restaurant in Charleston, and they have giant pits, custom-made pits where they have splayed pigs, being cooked over hot coals, directly over hot coals, which essentially mimics the pit in the ground with sticks in it and cooking the whole animal. And, from my limited perspective, that has become a fairly popular, if not trendy, cuisine. And I don't know if you have thoughts on if Rodney could become on the same level as Aaron Franklin, or is it just too specialized?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think whole hog cooking is very specialized. And honestly, even if Rodney put up all the videos in the world, I don't know how many people are going to tackle whole hog barbecue. I think it's just so much easier to do smaller cuts. And because of the reputation of whole hog barbecue and Carolina barbecue, people just think it's too vinegary. I'm hoping, though, as people notice what Ed Mitchell and Rodney Scott are doing and others, that they'll realize that, no, you've been getting North Carolina barbecue the wrong way, or Carolina barbecue the wrong way, because that vinegar sauce is not meant to be a condiment. It's something that's added throughout the cooking process that adds a depth of flavor. And so I think there's a great opportunity to educate people about whole hog barbecue. And another guy who's doing this is a guy named Dr. Howard Conyers, who is a rocket scientist, but he's a whole hog enthusiast. So it's really, we've got some interesting people kind of, trying to evangelize this type of barbecue. And, I just don't know if there's a real appetite for it around the country. I really don't know. Well, but I'm hopeful.
I have an appetite for it. I'd love to see it.
Okay.
So we talked a little bit yesterday and kind of pre-planning for this, just about the future of barbecue. And, there's been some interesting politics that's happened in the last week or so just around beef. There was the President Biden put out some sort of global climate change goals. And of course, the Republicans said that he was trying to take away their beef. And but then we saw like Epicurious, which is an arm of Condé Nast, say that they weren't going to publish beef recipes anymore. And I started to wonder how this will affect barbecue restaurants. I mean, you definitely see more vegetables on barbecue restaurants than you did even 5 or 10 years ago. But I think people go to barbecue restaurants for meat, and with the predominance of Central Texas, as you talked about, they go for beef. And I wonder, do you think this will have much impact as we move along and really try to tackle climate change on how barbecue restaurants will operate?
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting because, we love some beef, man, in this country. So I don't know how easily people are going to let go of that. And, brisket is the it. Brisket, whether it's chopped, sliced, burnt ends, whatever, that's the it meat right now. And so I don't see that abating anytime soon. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And, there are issues with pig farming as well. So, we don't want to say that that's so much better than beef, but it seems like a lot of the problems associated with climate change are to the way that we raise beef right now. And we've got to figure out a more sustainable way to do that. So to your point, yeah, I'm seeing more vegetables. Jackfruit, which is native to Asia, is becoming more prevalent on barbecue menus. And for somebody who knows what they're doing, they can make it look and taste like pork. But I got to tell you, even there were several restaurants here in Denver, Colorado, who had it on the menu. And they said, I checked in with them a couple months after they put it on the menu, and they said, yeah, we're just going to run it as a special every once in a while because it doesn't move. People want their meat. And the other hot trend in African-American barbecue is turkey. And I don't mean turkey breast. I mean turkey substitutes for certain types of barbecue. So in the Carolinas, you're seeing people doing chopped turkey instead of chopped pork. In Memphis, you're seeing pulled turkey instead of pulled pork. St. Louis has something called turkey ribs, which is really the shoulder blade of the chicken or the turkey that's cut in a way that there's more meat around it. It looks kind of like a rib. And in Chicago, I saw turkey hot links and turkey tips. So people are looking for healthier, options within barbecue, but the meat centered traditions are just very, very strong. And then, just not to get too far off it, but, the days of lab grown meat and 3D printed meat are practically here, right? So will people be grubbing on that? Will people grub on Impossible Ribs in 10 years? I don't know. But that future is actually here. I think it's just a matter of whether people are going to accept that. But if people accept lab grown meat, then, we can eat beef, for a long, long time.
Yeah, that'll be a very interesting question. Lab grown brisket, smoked. Yeah. Well, Adrian, we should give your readers a chance to ask some questions here. We've got about 15 minutes left. If you would, we've got like 40 some participants. Please throw your questions in the chat function here, and we'll serve them up to Adrian. In the meantime, what's your itinerary with a Black Smoke, Adrian, as you move through the pandemic and try to promote it?
Right. So right now there's just so much uncertainty, right? In terms of when to go to in-person events. So most of my events are virtual. So for the next month, I have a number of virtual events, just kind of like this event with bookstores and other things. I am starting to get some feelers for in-person events towards the end of June. Personally, I feel like I'll probably be doing more in-person events late summer, kind of fall. I think we'll feel much better about gathering in person. So, in a more traditional year, I would have been out on hitting the pavement, but yeah, I have to just hold back on that.
Are you vaccinated, Adrian?
I am. I did the one and done shot 3.5 weeks ago, so it should have been by now.
Good. So we do have one question from an anonymous attendee. Wants to know about your Kansas City barbecue competition. Getting your certification as a judge.
That's a great.
And what it takes to get it.
Yeah. So that's a great story. So I tell that story in the book, but basically, at 2004, I was just reading the newspaper and it said, hey, learn to become a barbecue judge. And I thought, oh, this will help me with my soul food research because so many soul food joints have a barbecue option on the menu. So I went to Adams County Fairgrounds in Colorado in the Denver area. And I walked in the room and I was the only dude under 250, as the kids say, 250 pounds for those who don't know that. So I saw my future and I was like, okay, whatever. So you sit down and they go through the categories. So in Kansas City Barbecue Society, the categories are pork, which is usually pork shoulder, ribs, brisket, beef, which is usually brisket, and then chicken. And most people, when they do chicken thighs because the fat content, you don't dry it out. And then you judge it on 3 criteria: taste, texture, and appearance. It's a 9-point scale. And then every barbecue society has some arbitrary rules. So in the Kansas City Barbecue Society, one example is you can only serve your barbecue on 3 certified greens: green leaf lettuce, flat leaf parsley, and cilantro. So if you made the best barbecue in the world and you served it on collard greens, disqualified. So they bring out food, they have you taste it and then get the hang of it. And then you take a barbecue oath. It's a sacred thing, which I'm not going to repeat right now because I know that some of you would mock it if I repeated it. And then a few weeks later, you get your badge in the mail. And at that point, you can go judge any contest. Now, the thing is that barbecue judging is so popular now that when they announce openings for contests, if you're not sitting at your computer ready to sign in at that moment, you're just going to be on a waiting list forever. So I pretty much now only do celebrity judging. I don't really get to do contest judging anymore because there's just too many judges. When I started judging, man, they were begging for judges. But this was before shows like Barbecue Pitmasters and other things. After those shows came on, dude, it's crazy.
So we have a question from Elaine. She wants to know, tell us about some of the Black barbecuers around the country who are trying out new products that they've not focused on before, including non-meat.
Yeah, so one place that I think is really interesting, and I'm sorry I don't remember the barbecuer's name, but there's a place in Oakland called Veg Mob, and he's doing, vegan barbecue. And I'm seeing this show up in restaurants. So there's a restaurant that I love in New York City in Harlem called The Seasoned Vegan, and they're doing rib tips with lotus root. You find other people doing it with burdock. So that's really interesting to me. We talked about the turkey, but one place that I love in Chicago that's using turkey is a place called Q's Wings and Tips. And I put that in my book as one of my top 20. There's also a place in North Carolina called Boogie's Barbecue that is doing turkey in addition to the chopped pork. So those are some of the things that you're seeing right now. And then, in terms of people who are doing brisket who didn't do it before, I don't want to call those restaurants out because I don't want them to get a lot of hate, but let me just say that the brisket that they're serving is more reminiscent of roast beef than say what you might expect, to find in a place like Texas. So, they have it on the menu, but it tastes good, but it's just not what I think of as barbecue.
Well, I think it's been written about a lot already, but these regional lines that have been so, starkly drawn across the country, they've really begun to blur. So you see more pork in Texas, you see more beef in Carolina. I don't know if you have found that in your own journeys for this book.
Yeah, when it comes to African Americans, and other food writers have noted this, when it comes to African American, there's really not a strong allegiance to these regional lines. I would say that fairly wherever you go, you're pretty much going to find ribs, some kind of spicy sausage, and chicken, and a lot of Black-run barbecue joints, unless it's narrowly focused on just one or two specific things. That seems to be a through line wherever you go. But I would say in terms of strict adherence to a regional style, I've probably found that more in the Carolinas than anywhere else in terms of African Americans kind of sticking to a regional style. Then once you get out of that area, man, it just seems like everything goes. But even with all of that, there's still certain styles that emerge. Like, for instance, South Side of Chicago, which doesn't get a shout out as a regional style, but I think it should. It's rib tips, hot link sausage, fries, white bread, all drowned in sauce. You see that. You've got the Kansas City type. You've got the Memphis. There's East Texas, which is different from West Texas, or Central Texas and West Texas, where in East Texas, you'll still have your brisket, your sausages, and your spare ribs, but typically the brisket's going to be chopped. It's going to be sauced. There's Creole side dishes like dirty rice, in addition to soul food side dishes. So it aesthetically, it's different than what you see in Central Texas, even though there's some common denominators there.
And is it a lot of the South Side Chicago done in, or at least historically done in, like fish aquariums?
Right, yeah, aquarium smokers, which seems to be a thing unique to the South Side of Chicago. And I think it's just like some guy in the area invented that, and the barbecuers liked it because there was a little bit of a showbiz aspect to it, right? You could really show off your cooking in front of your customers, and so it just became adopted. But yeah, those aquarium smokers are something you pretty much see in Black-owned joints on the South Side of Chicago.
So Donna has a question for you. She said, my grandparents lived in Kingston, North Carolina, in the eastern part of the state. We used to go to King's Barbecue whenever we visited for some of their vinegar-based pulled pork. Heaven. I'm curious whether the side dishes are also regional in nature. Remember, hush puppies and Brunswick stew were staples at King's.
Yeah, so this is going to trip you out, Donna. I actually have had King's Barbecue. Now, I went to Kingston, but I was there with Vivian Howard, so I didn't know about King's Barbecue. But I was on the Drew Barrymore show a couple months ago, and there was a barbecue contest, and King's Ribs was part of it. And so I had their barbecue, and they actually won that contest on the Drew Barrymore show. But to answer your question, yeah, much more regional variance with the side dishes. I would say, we always think of the meat as defining a barbecue style, but man, the side dishes, you do see that it definitely develops as a signature element of a regional style. There's kind of a universal potato salad, coleslaw, baked beans. But when you get to things like hush puppies or the certain way that the coleslaw is made in the Midwest and certain places, fries are everywhere when you have barbecue. The development of rib tips and other things, and hash. You see in the Brunswick stew, the burgoo in Kentucky. Yeah, you start to see all of these kind of different side dishes emerge.
Well, and you write about this a little bit in the book, Adrian, but how these soul food dishes become barbecue staples as they move into other parts of the country.
Yeah, so part of the story of barbecue is one of migration. And so, what immigrants do, or migrants, I should say, you get to the new place and you try to recreate home. And a lot of people do that with food. So once they get settled, they try to bring the familiar. And so a lot of these African Americans who wind up in other parts of the country are coming from the American South. And so they bring a sensibility of how barbecue should be made and served to these new locations. And sometimes it adapts to the location in terms of adding new side dishes and other things. But yeah, so collard greens, mac and cheese has now become a standard barbecue side. I'm not sure exactly when that happened, because that was definitely not the case in the early years of the migration. I think that's more of a recent thing. But definitely collard greens show up as a consistent barbecue side. And lately, fried okra has become a barbecue side, although again, I think that's a recent thing. Looking at menus and other things, you don't really see mentions of okra with barbecue. So yeah, there's definitely a soul food aspect of it. So you've got the soul food joints will have barbecue option on the menu, even though it's usually baked. And then black-owned black-owned barbecue joints usually have soul food side dishes.
So Barry wants to challenge you on the importance of high quality meats for barbecuing. Said, I would have thought to maximize taste, you would have want a relatively high fat content, which comes with the more expensive and higher quality cuts.
Yeah, so I think it's really just more of a price issue. I think if you're really talking about, if you're taking a really culinary approach to this, yeah, absolutely, you're right. But those meats are very pricey, and at least I can only speak to the African American experience. There's a lot of price pressure on them. They can't charge a lot of money for this, or they're just not going to have the customer base. So I just personally don't know of any inner city black joints that are serving brisket for $30 a pound, a slab of ribs for $24 a pound. The prices that you're seeing in these more suburban and white-owned places in other parts of town. I've been in barbecue joints where a slab of ribs was $12, $12 to $15, and people were belly aching about that. So I think because of and they're dealing with people who are working class, maybe marginally poor, so they try to have cheap options for their customers. So I think that's the dynamic that's going on, and why some would push back at the idea that you have to have high quality meat to have legitimate barbecue.
Well, and even the price of brisket, which used to be the cheap cut that barbecue specialists would use, that has gone up so much in the last few decades. So I'm not even sure a choice brisket would be considered cheap anymore.
I think you're right. That's definitely happened. And it's funny because as you go back through time, when the foods of kind of like working class people and marginalized people get discovered by elite chefs and other things, you see the same dynamic. So go back to the 60s, you'll see Washington Post articles about African Americans complaining about how expensive soul food is. These cuts of meat, like oxtails, for example, now are hugely expensive. And you see that dynamic. So I think it's just a replay of something we've seen in the past. Once something is quote unquote discovered, and it becomes more scarce, the price of it goes up tremendously. And we've seen that with brisket. We've seen that with oxtails. We've seen that with wings, right? Chicken wings.
Totally, with chicken wings.
Yeah.
So we've got just a few minutes left, Adrian. Linda wants to know What are the notable barbecue places in the Mid-Atlantic? This may be a tough one for the Denver native.
Yeah, so lately I got some sad news. So I listed a whole bunch of joints in my book, and I think one of my favorites in the DC area has there's been a change in management, and Tim told me about this, but I really love Texas 202 barbecue and Brandywine. Now, I have not been there since there's been a change in ownership, so hopefully they left behind the recipes and taught people how to cook, because that was really good stuff. But I just have not been there recently, so I don't know how great that barbecue is. Um, Other than that, most of the places I found, sorry, were usually in the South. And I'm talking about Black-owned places. Were usually in the South and other parts of the country. Sorry.
Well, I'll throw it out there that that's a Black-owned barbecue restaurant just opened maybe about a year or so ago. It's called Money Muscle Barbecue in Silver Spring. Definitely worth checking out. Definitely next time you come into town, Adrian.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? I just thought about some other places. So sorry. In DC, I like DC City Smokehouse. That's Black-owned. Then going down into like the Richmond, Virginia area, you've got Ronnie's Ribs. That's a place that's been around for a long time. And then, believe it or not, at Fort Lee, Virginia, there's a place called LePose Barbecue. You have to call ahead because he's got odd hours because being on a military base and stuff. But that I thought that was really good. So those are a few places that just came into my mind. So sorry, I forgot about those at the first run.
So there's an anonymous question here, and it wants to know more about the recipe development for the book. Did you develop recipes based on certain restaurants you loved?
No. So what I did is I tried to find recipes that I thought evoked the themes of a chapter. And then, truth be told, I'm much better at eating barbecue than cooking it. So I just reached out to chefs and just asked them, "Hey, can I use your recipe?" And to those chefs that I wasn't able to talk to, what I did is I did have a hire recipe developer, and we adapted recipes that we thought would work for the home cook. So but most of the recipes are from contributions from different barbecuers. And I just asked it, and then we just adapted it for the book, because some of the ways these restaurants cook their barbecue, you have to change it up for the home cook because you're dealing with different proportions and other things.
So Joanne wants to know how much you've researched barbecue in other countries and where those influence originated.
So I haven't heavily researched barbecue in other countries. I would say that, what's happening in Mexico, South Central America, is a deeper, richer tradition of barbecue. That's the earth oven technique. And then I've looked at barbecue in France. And from what I can tell, it was really African Americans around World War I era, World War II, that brought barbecue to that part of the world, because barbecue is hot in Europe right now. So I do need to look at other global traditions, but I think there's something exceptional about the way barbecue plays out in the United States. So I know it's trendy right now to say all barbecue, all cooking over fire, meat over fire is the same, but I think there's something exceptional about American barbecue.
Well, I think we have hit the hour here. Adrian, you have been fantastic as always. Thank you so much for your time, and best of luck with this new cookbook.
Thank you so much. Good to be with you.
Oh, thank you both so much for coming. An hour just flew by. We could have gone another 30 minutes, 45 minutes. Such a fascinating conversation. Thank you, everyone out there, for joining us this evening. Don't forget to check out the book. It is available on the Politics and Prose website. The link is in the chat. And while you're visiting the Politics and Prose website, you can click on the events tab and see what other events you're interested in attending in the future. We hope to see you there. In the meantime, stay well, everyone, and stay well read. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.
Great chat.